Hello, and welcome to the Astrology Hub podcast. My name's Amanda Pua-Walsh, and I'm the founder of Astrology Hub and the host of this podcast. And today is a very special day for this show, and I couldn't be happier to be celebrating it with you. Today is our 52nd episode, which means we're hitting an entire year of bringing you many of astrology's leading voices and contributors. And it also means you're listening, supporting us, and we're all growing together. I couldn't be more humbled or grateful for this milestone. We're also at 250,000 downloads. 250,000. Thank you so much to all of you who listen, who share with your friends, who support and have left us a review. I am so grateful. So here's to another year of deepening our understanding of this ancient science and art and creating more connected, purposeful, and magical lives as a result. Now, you've probably heard me talk about the new free Facebook group that we have opened to get ready for the upcoming 2020 forecast event and to discuss the podcast episodes. If you haven't joined that group yet, you can do so at Astrology Hub's Global Forecast Community. We'll also put that link in the show notes for you. But so the other day, I have to tell you this story. In a burst of inspiration, I reached out to that community and invited them to write their own personal love letter to astrology. I said, hey, you guys, let's write a group love letter to astrology, and we'll do that by each of you just sharing your own. So I shared mine, and then I was flooded with everybody's responses. I wanted to read a few of these love letters to you in celebration of the podcast 1 year of episodes anniversary, because they highlight why we're all drawn to this mysterious craft called astrology. All right, so listen to this. I may start crying. I just have to warn you, I cry every time I read these, but I'll do my best to pull it together. All right, so this one's from Jackie. She says, Dear Astrology, I've loved you since the age of 14. By 15, I thought I knew you, but you were so much older and wiser than me, and you had hidden depths that you held back, knowing I wasn't ready to uncover then. So I spent some years questioning you and questioning me, this Aries who hates working out, who's not overly confident. How can that be? Maybe you were a fraud. And we broke up for a while. Work got in the way, life got in the way, but I never forgot you. And you must have been watching, waiting for the right time, because you chose to reappear just a few weeks before, unknowingly, my life was about to be turned upside down. You knew that this was the time. You waited. Then you rode in to catch me as I was falling. I was ready. You broke the fall. We are both older now, and I'm wise enough to know that I'll never actually fully know you. But I am starting now to fully know me. You have given me a purpose, a quest, and an acceptance. We will never be parted again. All right, so much for keeping it together. You guys, this is so moving for me. Oh, are you crying too? Wow. Okay, this one's from Leslie. She says, I love you, astrology, for showing me that my darkness came in with me as lessons instead of thinking I was a bad girl all those years and that I might burn in hell. Thank you also for showing me that when I was learning my lesson on addiction, that you had a special set of aspects that could save me from myself and get me on stronger footing. Thank you for showing me, instead of marinating in my woundedness, that I could swim for shore and finally be supported and safe. Thank you for lifting me to this exact point in time where my heart is no longer afraid to be open, honest, vulnerable, and full of love. I'm immensely grateful. Okay, last one, or else I'll never make it through the episode. Okay, I had to read these 3. They were just so good. I literally read them and burst into tears. All right, here's this one from Julie. My dearest astrology, where to begin? I was different from my brother, who was a wild child Pisces. I was different than my grandmother, who was born on the Ides of March. I longed to unravel your mysteries, to be witness to the how of your magic. I delved into what I could find and drew charts. It was a beginning. I jumped from beginner astrology books to advanced because there was an intermediate at that time. It's been the longest love affair. And I feel like we're just learning to melt into each other, just learning how each other feel, just reaching out to each other's souls. I had my first real astrology reading 50 years ago. I gave my first astrology reading shortly after. You have taught me so much since those early days of flat charts. At my best and at my worst and everything in between, you are there showing me the guideposts to this crazy, amazing, weird journey. Oh my gosh, you guys, I am blown away every day at the depth and beauty that astrology brings to all of our lives, no matter where you're at in your journey. Maybe you're just curious and tuning in, and this is like your first listen. You're going, whoa, these people are over the edge. Just wait, my friends. You might be there with us someday. And for those of you who have been studying for decades, you know this. Like, this is why you tune in. This is why you're so interested. This is why this love affair just gets better. I mean, there's not many things we can say that about, right? I couldn't be more proud and honored to be a steward of this incredible masterpiece of a tradition called astrology. Okay, so that's the end of our celebration of the 52nd episode. It's not really, though. It's actually just the beginning, because today's guest couldn't be more fitting for this occasion. It's going to be a real treat for those of you who like to go deep into the philosophy behind astrology. Gary Caton has quite the story. He's the author of Hermetic Triptycha, the Mercury Elemental Year, and this is a man with a scope of knowledge that's going to blow you away. He also happens to be an Astrology Hub Inner Circle Guide and Mentor for 2020. Yay for us IC members! And if you're not a member yet and you love this episode, make sure to stay tuned for our next Inner Circle new member intake, which is coming very soon. All right, so one of my favorite things about interviewing so many of the world's most fascinating astrologers is discovering their backstory and how they got into the profession. So many of them tell me it's the last thing they would have expected for their life. And oh man, I can relate with that. Gary's no different. Gary was a student at the prestigious Virginia Tech School of Architecture and Design when he started having a series of what felt like strange and bizarre dreams to him involving animals. He began to open his life up to spirituality, and I'm going to let him take you on the fascinating journey of what happened next. But what I love about Gary is his deep understanding of Hermetic philosophy and the tarot and how astrology correlates with both. I also love his unique and inspiring approach to astrological magic. He was an inner circle guide for us a few years back, and during his moon cycle, his soul work assignments inspired me to dive into astrological magic as well. And I still wear a necklace of the Egyptian all-seeing eye that was inspired by the magic that we did during his moon cycle. I actually saw the eye in the clouds when I was doing the magic on the beach. And so, Gary, if you're listening, more please. We love it. Another thing that Gary is going to reveal in today's episode is the slightly misunderstood Law of Correspondence as given to us by Hermes himself, the inventor of astrology, or so some say. In the Emerald Tablet, most of us have heard the as above, so below principle. Well, Gary's got a missing key that's potentially been lost in translation. And once we have that piece, we can understand more fully how astrology plays its role in creating the miracles of the one in our everyday life. This episode is super deep, y'all. We're also going to cover what happens when Mercury retrogrades in the element of water, what the Gnostic mysteries reveal about the nature of the cosmos, what an alchemical month is, and what was happening in the sky when the Cathedral of Notre Dame was built the first time and now being rebuilt. And of course, I asked Gary for his take on why the upcoming 2020 is such a big deal. He'll be giving you a sneak peek on what life could be like on planet Earth in 2021, 2022, and 2023. I'll let him tell you more about that. Let's give Gary a super warm welcome. Mr. Gary Caton, it is so wonderful to have you back here in the Astrology Hub Mix. Thank you so much for joining us today for the podcast.
Oh, Amanda, it's wonderful to be here. I'm so happy to revisit my Astrology Hub family. Yeah, it's been a long time. Too long.
It has. It's been too long. I mean, when you came in a couple years ago as an inner circle guide, it was just like family Ohana was definitely the right word to use because everyone just embraced you and loved your teachings. It was so much fun.
The feeling is totally mutual too. I mean, hanging out at UAC was really fun. And to this day, I'm still blown away that you, the CEO of the company, were doing my homework and you did it so well. And I was just like, oh my God, she did exactly what I wanted them to do.
Oh, yeah. So he's talking about the soul work assignments. You guys, no, I do as many of the soul work assignments as I can, because the inner circle is for the members and it's for our team, and we get as much out of it as our members do. So yeah, for me, it's like, that's the fun of it.
I was really honored by that. That was the best thing ever. It was really fun.
It was fun for me too. Well, you brought in magic, which of course I'm going to do. Like, that's to me like the coolest thing is he's teaching us astrological magic. Let's do it. This is so fun.
Right. Of course. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, hopefully we get to do more of that. So let's back up a second though and talk about how you came to astrology. Tell us how you became an astrologer.
Right. So I was actually at Virginia Tech studying to be an architect. And I started having some dreams where animals were talking to me in English, right? And I started thinking, well, that's kind of weird. And I started looking into spirituality more. Like I got Jamie Sam's book, Medicine Cards, to find out about the animals and stuff. And that whole thing just kind of took on a life of its own. This is in the late 80s, when there was a lot of planetary stuff going on too, right? Anyway, long story short, after several years of really intense spiritual seeking, leaving school, hitchhiking around the country, I had a series of amazing dreams. And in the final one, I'm lying on my back in a field of green grass and the sun is directly overhead. And I can actually look right at it. This beautiful fiery ball, and inside the disk of the sun was the symbol for Venus. And I was like, oh, wow, that's got to mean something, And I got an ephemeris and deduced that on the day I had that dream, the sun and Venus were conjunct in Aries. And I was like, wow. And pretty much that changed my life completely. And I've been an astrologer ever since.
Wow. So you were able to actually see the conjunction in your dream. Do you continue to have experiences like that?
Sometimes I have really vivid dreams. Yeah. For some reason, that's one of my superpowers. Like, I'm not exactly sure how you would identify that in a chart. A lot of modern people, when I talk to them, and in fact, one time I was on one of these things where I was being interviewed, and there was even an ancient astrologer. He was like, "Oh, Gary, Neptune, whatever, dream astrologer." But if you research it, Hermes was considered the bringer of dreams, and of course, I'm a follower and a servant of Hermes. So ever since I was a kid, that's been one of the things that I have, and that particular dream has been, the seed for pretty much ever since 24 years old. That's been like my marching orders to define who I am as an adult.
Incredible. Wow.
I feel really, really privileged. Yeah.
I mean, any one of us could go to sleep tonight and have that kind of dream that literally changes the trajectory of your life. Right?
It can happen.
Why Hermes? Like, tell us about that. You said I'm a follower and servant of Hermes. Like, what's the story there?
Right. So again, a lot of people, when I was coming up, when I first started getting into astrology, if I would get a reading from an astrologer and say, I'm thinking about doing this astrology thing, what's my chart say about it? They would look at Uranus, right? Which is a perfectly valid approach. And there's reasons to think that I would be using that. But what I found after some time of getting deeper into the classical studies is that Hermes was considered the inventor of astrology. And in fact, for the Persians, who really were the inventors of magic, astrological magic as we know it, the Persians had a golden age while Europe was in the dark. They saw Hermes as basically an antediluvian, meaning before the flood, right? An antediluvian prophet on the order of Moses or somebody like that. And there's a lot of legends of the Hermetic Teachings, which the Hermetic Teachings are astrology, alchemy, and magic, right? The Hermetic Teachings coming out of Persia and going to Egypt and then returning to Persia. There's this really long tradition of Hermes being kind of the man for what we do. and discovering that, and discovering, he's sort of what you call the Almutin of the figure in my chart, and he's the bringer of dreams. And so discovering the Hermetic lineage that we're actually a part of has been a huge thing for and of course I wrote a book on Mercury. I've got 2 more that I'm supposed to do. I'm working on the second one now. And there's a Hermetic renaissance happening right now too. You may have heard Dan Brown donated a bunch of money so that a lot of these old texts could be digitalized. There's a museum over in Europe that's dedicated to all these Hermetic teachings. So there's kind of a resurgence of Hermetic awareness that's happening right now, which of course is part and parcel of the resurgence of awareness of astrology that's happening, because astrology is an Hermetic art.
So for anybody that's interested in understanding those Hermetic roots for astrology, is there like a good place to start in terms of things to read, or?
Well, there's a whole corpus. There's called a corpus hermeticum. I would start with the Emerald Tablet. Let's just say that. The Emerald Tablet is the source of the often actually misquoted maxim, as above, so below. What it actually says is that which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, in order to accomplish the miracles of the one. Now, and that's just one rubric, one verse of the Emerald Tablet. But the Emerald Tablet is basically a concise statement of transformation, of the process of alchemical transformation. And that is the source of the, as above, so below thing that most people are very familiar with, is the foundation for it's called the Doctrine of Correspondences, right? The stars tell us something about life here on Earth, and the macrocosm is related to the microcosm, and so on and so forth. But the Emerald Tablet is just part of what's called the Corpus Hermeticum, which is it's a group of texts that were translated by Marsilio
Ficino.
Ficino, yes, exactly, in the Renaissance times. And then there's a wider group of teachings called the Hermetica. It's not necessarily the corpus that was translated, but a wider group. They're essentially Gnostic mystery texts. They're like a conversation between a master and a student, and talking about the nature of reality and how the world was formed. There's a whole cosmology that goes along with this that's really beautiful. There's a lot to get into as far as Hermeticism, but I would definitely start with the Emerald Tablet. I had a copy of the Emerald Tablet on my desk for a while, and I was just always meditating on it, and what happened was I realized this idea of above, below, and the correspondences that I was witnessing is, as I was going out and doing my sky observations, I was witnessing that fact. And because, the planet Mercury has these times when it's above the horizon, and then it has times when it's below the horizon, invisible. And what I discovered is those events actually correspond, that what's called the maximum elongation above the horizon corresponds with the conjunction that happens in invisibility. And the next elongation, they all happen in the same degrees. And so that was the foundation for my book, is that it was literally a practical application of the Emerald Tablet, astronomically and astrologically.
Well, and so how does that correspond to what's happening in our lives?
Right. So these 3 events take about 40 days. So the 40 days, and of course in the middle of that is a Mercury retrograde. And the Mercury retrograde essentially being 40 days. 40 days is what's called an alchemical month. It's like the time that you would put something in. If I were going to put like some herbs and put some, Everclear to pull out the essential oil of the herb, I'd put it in there for 40 days. So and of course, 40 days, there's all, biblical and all kinds of parallels of, there's this transformational window. And so this above, below, above then becomes kind of a 3-step process of how we can navigate that 40-day sacred space of transformation, you see? And I could go on, obviously, but I found it tremendously useful, obviously, understanding the element, for instance, that's happening in right now. We're in the water year where all the Mercury retrogrades are happening in water. So the interesting thing about water, to get back to the Dan Brown idea in the sense of like these sort of spiritual bestsellers, what does water do? Water tends to pool together in large bodies eventually. And so there's these mass swings in popularity. For instance, both, do you remember the Celestine Prophecy?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, I remember back when that was out, my New Age church, we had a study group on that and everything. And of course, you remember The Secret. Those both were published in years when Mercury retrogrades were happening in water. So there's this huge pooling effect that it draws huge numbers of people together around this work. So that's a property of water, you see. And so when the Mercury retrogrades are happening in water, the properties of that element become more transparently active in our lives and in the world.
I love it. All right, Gary. So let's talk about 2020 a little bit. You're going to be one of our inner circle guides, which we're so excited about. And it's a big year, right? So tell us what you're seeing, what you're kind of anticipating for us.
One of the most interesting things for me about 2020, and I wrote about this. I do the calculations and some writing for a celestial planting calendar that's based on biodynamic agriculture principles. And I wrote about this for them as well. I did some research. In the last 1,000 years, there's only been 4 times that the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto have been within about 10 degrees of each other for the entire year. And this is, a very rare event. Now, the last time happened to be in 1980. So we have a fairly recent corollary for this. And it's interesting because one thing that happened in 1980 is that the foundations for the World Wide Web were set in place by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, right? There's this coming together of these 3 things that is very rare. And there's this extremely potent seed potential that could be planted through that coming together. And so, obviously the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction isn't exact until December, but the entire year they're going to be like pretty close and just kind of moving back and forth together. So I think that really the entire year we can be sort of planting seeds for something that has like potential beyond anything we could even possibly imagine.
Wow. And do you have any insight into like what area of life you think it will affect?
Well, yeah. I mean, in 1980, we also, that happened in Libra. That was Jupiter, Saturn happening in Libra. It was the first conjunction not to happen in an earth sign for about 200 years. It was actually the first conjunction to happen in an air sign for almost 800.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, the last time an event that happened recently that was in the same part of the 800-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle, Notre Dame Cathedral was built at a time when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were moving from Earth to air. And this is the first time that that's happened again since that cathedral was built. And now we see it in the news again. It's on fire and it needs rebuilding.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is really incredible. And of course, like I said, in 1980 and really the 20 years afterwards, that was the foundation for the internet and so many the whole tech boom that we now take for granted in our daily lives that allows you and I to be having this conversation. That seed was planted back with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 1980. So that conjunction, I think, and it happened in the first decan of Libra. That means it's the first 10-degree segment, right? If you divide it into Libra into 3 10-degree segments. And there's a tarot card that goes along with that, which is part of what I'm going to be talking about in my month, right? So we can look at that tarot card, which is the 2 of Swords. We can look at that as a sort of mandala that has application for the next 200 years. That it's basically a mandala for our time. And I think that it would be tremendously potent and tremendously conscious raising and conscious expanding to go through the exercise of really reimagining and reframing and reworking that image into something constructive and useful and applicable to our personal lives and to the present moment.
Okay, so let me back up a sec here. So what you're saying is it would be helpful for us to look at the tarot card that is the Two of Swords, to actually like meditate on the image of that.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then apply that to our own lives and how we can work with the message of that image to improve our lives, essentially, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. Like, for instance, the most common deck is the Rider-Waite, right, which is based on the Golden Dawn teachings. And you see a figure with two swords and the cross like this, and it's blindfolded. And the common interpretations are that this is about peace, right? And think about what it takes to actually achieve peace. For instance, I read something recently about, marriages that last. And it was talking about things that people do, practices that they have that we can learn from. And one of the things is they don't push each other's buttons. They willingly turn a blind eye to things that they are never going to agree with their partner on. Because always going to be those things. You and I are never going to agree on everything. It's not possible. So if we're going to cohabitate for any length of time, we've got to say, okay, you have that thing, it's your thing. I totally disagree, but I love you and I honor you, so I'm not going to bother you about that. I'm going to let you be. I'm going to let your truth be your truth, and I'm going to keep my truth to myself, and we're just going to live in peace. I mean, it's such a simple thing, but it's a tremendously difficult practice, actually, because I think people have the mistaken idea that no, we have to work through this. We have to find, if we're good at relating, we'll find a solution. And it's like, sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes you just have to agree to disagree.
Well, there's that idea of compromise. Like, you'll give up something of value to yourself.
Sometimes that works.
Sometimes it works, but I mean, sometimes that just means we're both giving up something that we actually truly value.
Oh my God. Yeah. We went through that. My wife and I went through that with trying to find a house, house hunting. I mean, it was really revealing for me because like the first thing I want to look at is the yard and like, she, of course, women generally look at the kitchen and the bathrooms. And here's the funny thing about that. That's where the value is. If you want to buy a house, you're going to get your money back out of. If it's got good kitchens and bathrooms, that they say about the woman always being right.
Yeah, I do.
But anyway, we were doing this thing where we were trying to compromise, and we would end up with these places that I wasn't really crazy about. She wasn't really crazy about. But it was somewhere in the middle of what we were both crazy about. So shouldn't that be good? And it's like, no.
Yeah. How can you get to a place where you're both crazy about it? And, both of your needs are being met, whatever those values are.
Or what about what we came to was I was like, hey, you know what? What if it's just your turn to be, to be the one who gets what they're crazy about, and next time I'll take my turn, whatever. Like there's different ways to go about it, right? But I was like, there's no sense in us living this compromised life that neither one of us is crazy about. At least one of us could be crazy about it.
Yeah, and another person could be happy for the other person being crazy about it, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I like this. So what does it take to achieve peace? So meditating on that idea and how we can bring that forward in our life in many different ways, because obviously we are the microcosm. So if it's hard for us to do that in our own personal lives, how could we ever expect it to happen on a global scale?
Yeah, exactly. And when you come to topics like religion and politics and the common the traditional thing was you don't bring that to the dinner table, right? Because we're probably not going to agree, and even if we are, probably not going to happen tonight.
It's probably not going to happen ever.
So there's that blindfolded figure again, Yeah, and so all this polarization that you hear about everywhere, and it's like I feel like there's this tendency to keep poking something when it's a sore spot, and it's like maybe you need to leave it alone and let it heal, before we poke it too much or whatever. There's like a huge potential for meditation on that symbol and what it means, and politically and personally and everything. So that's the one that was before. Now, the one that's on its way in 2020, Jupiter and Saturn will be conjunct in the first decan of Aquarius. That card is associated, that decan is associated with the Five of Swords. So working with that image as well can be really good as a preparatory, as a working into the wave of energy that's coming.
Okay, so can you describe it for us a little bit for those that aren't familiar?
Yeah, traditionally in the Rider-Waite, there's a dude and he's picking up some swords. And now to me, I see this look on his face like he, sort of like a little trickster-ish or something. And there's two other people who are like walking away, and it looks like they've abandoned their swords, and this other person is like picking them up. So you're left with the question, is this person stealing the swords, or are they just capitalizing on someone else's loss? Like that Grateful Dead song, one man gathers what another man spills, St. Stephen, that whole idea of, one person's trash is another person's treasure. There's a lot going on in that card as well in terms of like this unstable. 5 cards are generally thought of as relatively unstable because 4 is a very stable number. But in order to keep growing past the 4, you almost either have to allow or initiate an element of instability. And this is very alchemical. The interplay between the fixed and the volatile. This is everywhere in alchemy. You'll hear them say, make the fixed volatile and the volatile fixed. So moving from a place of, because if you just stay in that 4 state too long, it becomes a prison. You become stuck. You become, right? It's like, bored and complacent and blah, 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 blah. So there has to be this element of change that enters with the 5. And so how can we do that productively? You hear about, for instance, the winners and the losers in any, this card seems to be about that. Like someone has to lose for someone else to gain. There's this idea that, and it's like, man, that's a tough one. Because, we always hear about, well, how can we create win-win scenarios and all this stuff. But so if we can see that card as somehow a little differently, where perhaps, there's a trade-off between the people that are leaving and the people that are coming. But to me, it's really telling in the sense that, as we talked about before, we're leaving behind 200 years of the conjunctions in the earth signs. So people who are really invested and their worldview is determined by that energy, I mean, it's never coming back again in this lifetime, and not for many, 800 years. And so the people who are really invested in the air, they're sort of the ones picking up the swords, and the people that are invested in the earth thing are sort of the ones, leaving the swords behind. And how can we manage that interface more productively where, somebody doesn't go away with hurt feelings, and the person who is not taking is picking up the stuff, is not taking unfair advantage, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of ethical ambiguity there. And there's a lot of just basic, how do we handle change? How do we handle transition? How do we get enough volatility to get us moving, but not so much that it becomes destructive or malevolent or something like that, right?
Yeah. Wow. Some big themes. So we're going to be moving from the 2 of Swords to the 5 of Swords throughout the year. That's sort of the progression of the movement. Okay.
Yep. Really, for the 5 of Swords will define the next 20 years after 2020.
Okay. Wow. Fascinating. So we can be thinking about that as we prepare for 2020. Gary, I had Anne Orderly on the podcast last week. She's also going to be an Inner Circle guide in 2020. Actually, the first one. She's going to be our guide in January. And one of the things she was saying is that conjunction happening in December in the past has been an indicator that the king dies. And so she has said that when people are thinking about who will be reelected in November, she's saying, don't worry about who's reelected as president. It's actually the vice president that we should be caring about, because it seems like, the energy is pointing to whoever's elected won't make it. So what do you have to say about that?
I can certainly understand, and I don't dispute that as a valid possibility. there's a rich tradition with that. It's a basic historical fact that presidents that were elected in 0 years died in office for a long time, U.S. presidents. And a lot of people associated this with something called Tecumseh's curse.
What do you mean 0 years?
Year ending in 0. So 2020, 2000, 1980, etc. And of course, 2000, that was G.W. Bush, right? He didn't die. So there's that chain. Reagan was shot, but he was shot by a lunatic who used the wrong gun if you want to kill somebody, basically. And so the bullet was just small enough that it didn't quite make it to his heart, and he survived. So some people think that this chain of events that she's talking about has been broken. Doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't, it just had a hiccup. But the other thing is that...
What's Tecumseh's curse?
Right. So Tecumseh's curse is very interesting. This is a really fascinating story. When I was a boy, my father had this book, and it was about this thick. It was definitely the biggest book I had ever read at the time. It's called The Frontiersman, and it's a story of people like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton and these people who came from the East and settled the Midwest. The Midwest was the original frontier, right? And one of the characters in this book is Tecumseh, the Shawnee Native American chief, but also prophet. His brother, really, I think his name is, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, and forgive me, but Tenskwata, he was known as the prophet, and Tecumseh was more of the chief. But Tecumseh had this vision, and if he had been successful, it would have drastically altered history as we know it, because he said, hey, look, all of us native tribes, if we get together, we have a chance of beating these white men. But separately, we're just going to get picked off one by one. And so he said, we should all get together. And then he had a plan. And the plan was, he knew there was going to be an eclipse. He was educated. He was an educated person. And he found out that there was going to be an eclipse. Now, where the earthquake part comes from, I don't know. Might have been intuition, but he told all the tribes up and down the Atlantic seaboard, there will be a great darkening of the sky. And sometime after that, I will stamp my foot and the earth will shake. There will be a great shaking. And that's the signal that we should all attack. And I mean, think about it. By the way, there was an earthquake, and it was called the Real Foot Lake. It was called the... what's the name of it? There's a fault line there near the Mississippi. The Mississippi River, the New Madrid earthquake, the Mississippi River ran backwards, and it created a lake. It's called Real Foot Lake. And the cabins were leveled for thousands of miles. And that would have been the perfect time to attack, because everybody was in a state of confusion and disarray. But what happened was his brother evidently got a little egotistical about the title of being the prophet, and he led them into battle early. And so Tippecanoe, the Battle of Tippecanoe was, which president was that? Was that Harrison? William Henry Harrison? Is that right? I might be getting my history wrong, and if so, forgive me. But there was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. I remember that much. But he was the first president elected in this 0 year with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions happening in Earth. And Tecumseh said that he will die in office, and every president elected after him in his 0 year will also die in office. That was supposedly Tecumseh's curse. And it came true again and again and again and again. And as I said, Reagan was the first one. He didn't dodge the bullet, but he survived the bullet. And then G.W. Bush, as far as I know, there was no assassination attempt on him. But think about this. There was an assassination attempt on our country in the form of 9/11. So did we really dodge the bullet there?
So basically we had Reagan. Before that was Kennedy, right?
Yeah, Kennedy, yeah. And then 20 years before that, FDR.
Okay. Wow. That's really interesting. Okay. So we don't know. I mean, the curse could be broken. The curse could still be there. Is there an astrological explanation for this?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, the Native American people lived on the earth. They were people of the earth. I mean, you hear this saying, so-and-so is salt of the earth. I mean, there's nothing more salt of the earth than living in a teepee or a wigwam, or, and they were people of the earth, and they were very aghast at the way that we cut all the trees down and burned up all the, and they thought, that we were crazy. And so with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions happening in Earth signs, this idea of this curse for people who were mistreating the Earth, kind of makes sense, right? That their leaders would be, cut down. And so, it begs the question, like, now that we're moving into air sign, because, the U.S. was founded in a time when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were in the fire signs. So the air signs and the fire signs get along more than fire and earth, right? What does fire do to earth? It scorches it, it burns it up, whereas fire and air tend to cooperate a little bit more. Yeah, that's basically the astrological reason is elemental. And, this idea that we're moving into the information age and technology explosion and all that, it's very possible we have only scratched the surface of what the internet is capable of. Because what happened was after 1980, when you had that first conjunction in air, then we had another one in Earth in 2000. So then, you had basically the monetization of the internet, right? Earth. And so, a lot of people say that the early principles of the internet were actually pretty utopian. A lot of people thought there would be this utopian thing that happened, and blah, blah, blah. And then it's got and then a lot of people think that it's gotten off track, including, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. I've heard him say that, we need to get this thing back on track with the original vision. So with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions now returning to air and going to be in air for like 160 years, it's quite possible that we'll see a whole nother way of being, a whole nother way of, a whole nother economy, a whole nother that is, beyond anything that we've just scratched the surface with what we've done so far.
That resonates pretty deeply for me. I think that's probably right on. We have no idea. We can't even conceive of it. We couldn't have conceived of what we're doing today. We couldn't have conceived of it 20 years ago. There's no way. If you told people that, it'd be like, yeah, right. Then the things that we can dream of, like flying cars and, maybe something just totally different, right? Well, Gary, I'm really excited for your mastery class teaching as well. So can you tell us a little bit about what that mastery class teaching is and why you think it's so helpful for people to have this tool?
Right. So one thing I left out of the story when I talked about my dream, I forgot to mention that I started out with tarot before I had the dream with the astrology. I was working with the tarot, and a lot of people who do astrology, of course, work with the tarot, and it's a really lovely tool that is still one of my beloved ways of, as an oracle and as a personal growth tool and whatnot. And one of the beautiful things about it is there is a direct, explicit connection between certain tarot cards and certain astrological configuration. And these were laid out in the early 20th century by a group called the Golden Dawn, who were a bunch of occultists that got together and formed this society called the Order of the Golden Dawn. A lot of people are familiar with various connotations of the major arcana. Like, for instance, the World card is associated with the planet Saturn. But there's also direct connections with all of the minor arcana cards, too. So that the minor arcana cards can all be related to these 36 decans, these 10-degree segments of the zodiac. And so it's just fun. It's just a wonderful way to say, oh, so literally, for instance, the first decan of Taurus, where we're going to have the new moon during my lunation, that's ruled by Mercury. So Mercury in the first 10 degrees of Taurus is the astrological symbol for the Five of Pentacles. And we can begin to talk about those relationships and begin to understand those tarot cards using our astrology tools. And I just think that's a lot of fun. And it's really eye-opening on a lot of levels, too, because, as I said, as we did before with those two cards for the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, there's tremendous meditative potential, and, you can get a lot out of just examining the cards,
Yes. Now, Gary, how do you work with this? So you're an astrologer and you obviously work with the tarot. So how do you weave these together in your practice?
Right. So oftentimes if somebody's having trouble with a difficult transit, for instance, You can talk to them about using the relationship with that card that represents that decan where that transit is happening as a window into it, where they can, because, in 60 to 90 minutes, after 90 minutes, I've pretty much said everything I've got to say. And most people I've had a few that, we end up talking for 4 hours or something, but that's definitely the exception. But it's sort of a way that they can sort of, in Jungian work, they call it dreaming the dream forward. You can take that, it's a tool for them to take from the consultation and keep working that energy, keep working with that tarot card as a meditative tool, as a way to re-enter the energy of that consult where we were really getting into the dynamics of what's going on there. And sort of a window for them to re-enter into that and keep that process going, rather than just, it was a reading, it happened, now it's done. It's a way to keep that energy flowing in their lives, right?
Very cool. Gary, some people say that astrology is the mother of tarot. Do you believe that's true?
Yeah, I do. I mean, for instance, some of the images, it's explicit. In the Two of Swords we were talking about earlier, there's literally a moon right there, right? Well, the moon is the ruler of the first decan of Libra. So there's very explicit astrological information in the images themselves. So yeah, I do. I think so. Yeah.
So Gary, will you give our Inner Circle Ohana, our Inner Circle members, actual cheat sheets that they can walk away with the reference of each of the positions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because it seems like something that we would refer back to over and over, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is something that hopefully they will refer to back over and over again. And so, I'll give them the outline, and I'll give them the locations of some of these important historical alignments, and to look at how are these cards still active in the mass consciousness and stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. And one of my favorite things to do with it is actually to question some of the dogma that has developed, because some of these cards, they take on pretty negative connotations, and I don't know that they necessarily have to always be interpreted negatively, right? And so one of the things that I do often is I encourage people to research and to look at other decks and see how and I remember, this one lady, she had a relationship with the Three of Swords, which is, that's a really difficult card. It's got three swords, piercing a heart. It's like, and she shared with me all this stuff about how that had shown up, that imagery had shown up in her life with three children and so on and so forth. And she just expressed how liberating it was to see that there were alternative ways of interpreting that energy. And she was so excited. And she hugged me 10 times before I left the thing, because, it's not fate. You're participating in this. You can help to evolve that image for everyone by evolving it for yourself, right? It's really beautiful.
I mean, it happens in astrology too, right? Certain transits, certain planets, certain, they have those connotations. And I like what you're saying, because it gives us an opportunity to co-create with reality, right? That's magic.